In nearly 5 decades of acting, Daniel Day-Lewis has starred in only about 20 films total, and fewer than a dozen that actually count by his own famously selective standard, choosing his directors the way most people choose who they'd trust with their own life, rather than simply who's offering the biggest paycheck. Some of those directors he worked with only once, a single blazing collaboration neither side ever felt the need to repeat. One he kept returning to across 3 separate films, and trusting him more than any other filmmaker alive. At 68, having broken his own retirement for the first time in nearly a decade, Day-Lewis has effectively told us, through the films he keeps circling back to and the ones he never touched again, exactly who actually mattered most across a career most actors could never dream of matching. Let's count them down. Number 5 is Steven Spielberg for 2012's Lincoln. Day-Lewis initially doubted he could even attempt playing one of the most consequential figures in American history, worried the role sat somehow beyond what any actor could reasonably claim to capture. And it reportedly took real, sustained persuading from Spielberg, with some additional help from Leonardo DiCaprio, before he finally agreed to take it on. Once he said yes, he committed with a depth that outstripped nearly everything else on this entire list. And that's measured against a man who once broke his own ribs and caught pneumonia for other roles. He spent a full year reading more than 100 books about Lincoln before a single scene was ever shot, absorbing not just the historical record, but the specific cadences and contradictions of the man himself. He then remained fully in character for all 3 months of principal photography, insisting everyone on set, including Spielberg himself, address him only as Mr. President the entire time, never once breaking that formality, even during downtime between setups. Historians who'd been brought on as consultants for the film, the exact people most likely to nitpick every small historical detail out of professional habit, instead found themselves genuinely stunned by how closely Day-Lewis had captured Lincoln's voice, his awkward, loping physical mannerisms, even the specific, deliberate way he walked across a room. Day-Lewis has said, in one of the most quietly devastating lines he's ever offered in any interview, that he never felt that same depth of love for another human being he had never actually met, and that he genuinely wished Lincoln had simply stayed with him forever once filming finally wrapped. It earned him his 3rd Best Actor Oscar, a record no other performer in Academy history has matched before or since, an achievement so singular that when he'd won his 2nd Oscar years earlier for There Will Be Blood, he'd knelt, jokingly, in front of presenter Helen Mirren and told her that moment was the closest he'd ever come to receiving an actual knighthood, a small joke about his own English heritage, only for Queen Elizabeth's own grandson, Prince William, to formally knight him for real 2 years after Lincoln was released, turning what had started as a light-hearted quip on an award stage into an entirely genuine honor.
It remains the single performance most frequently cited by critics, historians, and Day-Lewis's own peers alike as the definitive proof of exactly what he's capable of when a role finally deserves the full, complete weight of everything he's willing to give it.
Number 4 is Michael Mann, for a single film that still gets cited as the moment Day-Lewis proved he could be a genuine action lead without losing an ounce of the emotional depth critics already respected him for. For 1992's The Last of the Mohicans, playing Hawkeye, a white man raised by the Mohican people during the French and Indian War, Day-Lewis trained under an actual U.S. Army colonel in authentic hand-to-hand combat and period-accurate marksmanship, learned to build his own wooden canoes entirely by hand rather than rely on prop versions, and carried a genuine heavy flintlock rifle with him at all times throughout the entire shoot rather than swap it out for something lighter between takes, insisting the weight itself was part of understanding the character. Before filming even began, he spent an entire month living completely alone in the wilderness of the actual region his character would have come from, teaching himself real survival skills with no crew, no script, and no cameras anywhere nearby, purely so the physical confidence he brought to set would be genuine rather than performed. Critics called his performance the heart and soul of the entire film, a rare, difficult combination of rugged physical intensity and genuine emotional tenderness that turned what could easily have been a straightforward, forgettable adventure picture into something audiences still consider one of the great romantic epics of the entire 90s. It remains, to this day, the only film Day-Lewis and Mann ever made together, a single blazing collaboration neither man apparently felt any real need to repeat, having already gotten everything either of them was looking for out of that one attempt. Unlike the repeat partnerships he built with nearly everyone else on this list. Number 3 is Martin Scorsese, the legend Day-Lewis worked with twice across a decade, in 2 performances that couldn't have looked more different from each other if he'd planned it that way deliberately. In 1993's The Age of Innocence, playing a repressed, torn 19th-century New York lawyer caught between duty and forbidden desire, Day-Lewis spent 2 full months simply wandering the city in his character's complete period wardrobe, absorbing the specific world Edith Wharton had written about a century earlier, before a single scene was even filmed, and refused to speak a single word to co-star Richard E. Grant, who played his rival in the film, for the entire shoot, only breaking his silence on the very last day of filming to thank him personally for putting up with the cold treatment. Critics praised the performance for its complex subtlety and restraint, drawing comparisons to Laurence Olivier at his most controlled and precise, even as the film's own leading lady, Winona Ryder, received the Oscar nomination. Day-Lewis himself was somehow passed over for that particular year, a snub many critics still consider one of the more baffling oversights in Academy history. 9 years later came Gangs of New York, and the transformation could not have been more extreme if he'd tried. To play the terrifying, dagger-wielding gang leader, Bill the Butcher, Day-Lewis apprenticed as a real working butcher, hired professional circus performers to teach him authentic knife-throwing technique, and wore a prosthetic glass eye he trained himself to tap rhythmically with a blade without ever flinching or blinking, a small, unsettling detail that ended up defining the character on screen. He caught pneumonia mid-shoot after refusing warmer clothing simply because heavier fabric wouldn't have matched the historical period, and stayed so deep in character throughout production that he once went to dinner with Scorsese and a young Leonardo DiCaprio, still fully inhabiting Bill the Butcher, terrifying the restaurant's waitress badly enough that she was reportedly too afraid to approach the table at all. The film earned 10 Oscar nominations overall, including one for Day-Lewis himself, whose performance was singled out repeatedly by critics as bringing both ferocious, unpredictable energy and a strange, magnetic charisma that somehow made an outright monster impossible to look away from for the entire runtime. Scorsese got two entirely different men out of the same actor across those two films, one nearly silent for 2 straight months, the other so loud and dangerous that a Manhattan restaurant staff needed genuine reassurance he wasn't actually real. Number 2 is Paul Thomas Anderson, the modern auteur who wrote an entire film specifically hoping Day-Lewis would say yes to it, an almost unthinkable gamble for a director working with an actor that selective. After learning Day-Lewis was a genuine fan of his earlier film Punch-Drunk Love, Anderson built There Will Be Blood in 2007, with him in mind from the very first draft of the screenplay, and Day-Lewis, notoriously difficult to land for any project, regardless of prestige or pedigree attached, accepted almost immediately, describing it later as feeling like a match made in heaven from the moment he first read the pages. He spent 3 years preparing for the role of ruthless oil prospector Daniel Plainview, listening to archival recordings from the turn of the century to build the character's distinctive, clipped voice, poring over letters and photographs of real oil tycoons and laborers from the period to understand exactly how such men carried themselves. He stayed so completely inside the character throughout production that the one time he accidentally broke it on set, the clip surfaced years later and instantly went viral, simply because that kind of slip was so vanishingly rare for him. He improvised entire speeches Anderson hadn't written at all, and Anderson loved every one of them enough to keep them in the final cut rather than reshoot to the original script. It earned Day-Lewis his second Oscar, making him just the 8th actor in Academy history to win Best Actor twice, in a performance critics still describe today as one of the greatest ever captured on film, regularly appearing near the top of any serious list of the finest screen performances of the 21st century. A decade later, in 2017, the two reunited for Phantom Thread, and the transformation was almost total. Day-Lewis spent an entire year training under the New York City Ballet's head of costuming to learn genuine dressmaking from scratch, eventually skilled enough to recreate an actual Balenciaga gown by hand. Anderson later said Day-Lewis contributed so much material to the finished screenplay through collaboration and improvisation that he arguably deserved a co-writing credit of his own. Everyone on set, cast and crew alike, referred to him only as Reynolds for the entire shoot. It became Day-Lewis's final Oscar nomination, delicate and restrained in a way that stood in almost total contrast to Daniel Plainview a decade earlier, and, for the next 8 years, his final film altogether, the performance he chose, at the time, to close an entire acting career on, before anyone knew there would eventually be one more chapter still to come. The best one. The answer Day-Lewis has never had to say out loud, because his own career already said it for him. Jim Sheridan, the Irish director who arguably changed the entire shape of Day-Lewis's career more than anyone else on this list, even if he never became the most famous name attached to it. Their first collaboration, 1989's My Left Foot, cast Day-Lewis as Christy Brown, a real Dublin writer and painter born with cerebral palsy who could control only his left foot, in a script that famously arrived through his own front door in London, sent by a producer who was a longtime friend of Brown's after a chance conversation at a party weeks earlier that Day-Lewis had nearly forgotten about entirely by the time the envelope actually landed on his doormat. Day-Lewis spent 8 weeks preparing at an actual cerebral palsy clinic near Dublin, learning to type and paint with his foot exactly the way Brown genuinely had, then refused to break character for the entire 6-week shoot that followed, staying hunched in a wheelchair so long it broke 2 of his own ribs, requiring crew members to feed him and lift him over cables between takes, since Christy himself couldn't manage utensils or obstacles on his own. He spent his off hours forging real friendships with disabled people in Dublin, just to understand Brown's daily life more completely, determined that nothing about the performance would feel like imitation rather than lived experience. It earned him his first Academy Award and made him, virtually overnight, one of the most talked-about actors of his generation. Sheridan brought him back in 1993 for In the Name of the Father, playing Jerry Conlon, a man wrongfully imprisoned for an IRA bombing he didn't commit, and Day-Lewis matched the role's brutality with his own, spending 3 days locked in an actual jail cell without water, instructing crew members to douse him with cold water, verbally abuse him, and bang on the cell walls whenever they passed to keep him sleep-deprived, all while 40 pounds lighter than his normal weight and speaking the entire shoot in a Northern Irish accent he never once dropped. Critics called the In the Name of the Father performance haunting, describing it as one of the most vivid, unsparing depictions of wrongful imprisonment ever put on screen, earning Day-Lewis another Oscar nomination for a director he clearly trusted with material almost nobody else got to touch. They reunited once more in 1997 for The Boxer, with Day-Lewis playing a former IRA prisoner rebuilding his life through boxing after years behind bars, training 18 months alongside real professional fighters under the guidance of former world champion Barry McGuigan, who said afterward that Day-Lewis had genuinely become good enough to hold his own against some of the best boxers of that entire era, a claim few actors preparing for a role could ever hope to actually earn from a genuine champion rather than simply hear as flattery. 3 films, 3 decades apart in tone, but never in intensity, and the one director Day-Lewis trusted enough to hand him the role that started everything, a partnership built on total mutual understanding of exactly how far the other was willing to go. There's one more name worth mentioning, even though he doesn't belong on this list in the traditional sense at all. In 2025, 8 years after Phantom Thread, and 8 years after Day-Lewis told the world in 4 flat, unelaborated sentences that his acting career was over for good, he broke that retirement for the first time, not for a legend, not for a filmmaker with 3 decades of prestige behind him, but for his own son. Ronan Day-Lewis, 27 years old, and until then known mainly as a painter with gallery exhibitions rather than film credits to his name,
made his directorial debut with Anemone, co-writing the script alongside his father and casting him as Ray Stoker, a reclusive former British soldier who spent 2 decades in self-imposed exile in the woods of northern England, estranged from the family he'd left behind years earlier without explanation. The film explored exactly the kind of father-son and brother dynamics that shaped so much of Day-Lewis's own life and career. Though Ronan has been careful to note, the story was never meant as strictly autobiographical, more an exercise in imagination that happened to circle back toward themes both of them recognized in each other regardless.
Asked what finally pulled him back in front of a camera after nearly a decade of total, uncontested silence he'd never once wavered from, despite endless speculation and rumored offers over the years. Day-Lewis didn't talk about craft, legacy, or the responsibility of the artist the way he had in his retirement statement. There was always a great ease in each other's company, he said simply, describing what it actually felt like working alongside his own son on set for the first time. Ronan, for his part, has said he felt the pressure of that collaboration more deeply than any external expectation about his father's long-awaited comeback, driven mostly by a private, personal fear of somehow letting him down, rather than any real concern about how critics or wider audiences might eventually respond to the finished project. The film premiered at the New York Film Festival in October of 2025 and opened in theaters shortly after, drawing a mixed but genuinely moved critical response overall. Most reviewers agreeing on one point, regardless of everything else they debated about the finished film, that watching Daniel Day-Lewis return to the screen at all, for any reason, after nearly everyone had long since accepted he simply never would again, was worth the price of admission entirely on its own. After a career spent handing his complete, uncompromising trust to 5 of the greatest directors alive, sacrificing ribs, lungs, and months at a time to men like Sheridan, Scorsese, Mann, Anderson, and Spielberg, it turned out the one director who could finally bring him back wasn't found on any list of legends at all. He was sitting at the family dinner table the entire time, waiting for his own turn. If this look behind the collaborations that built Daniel Day-Lewis's career moved you, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. There are decades more stories hiding behind that quiet, relentless commitment than any single ranking could ever fully capture.